All right, Isaiah chapter 63. Many commentators treat this as a continuation of what began, especially from 61 and 62. It really has to do with the revelation of the Messiah, of his intentions, his thoughts, his leadership. And that revelation does extend into chapter 63, though the Messiah is not the speaker. In this case, those who are speaking in the beginning part of Isaiah 63 are Jewish survivors in the tribulation who are now speaking about the Messiah. They're speaking about the appearing of the Messiah and how they see that unfolding. So again, still very much pertains to the same scenario of the end of the age, the Messiah is appearing, and he's just giving a little bit more detail about that. Again, it groups together really well with 61 and 62. And so a lot of people don't actually break up the section until we get down to verse 7. So that's how we're going to treat it as well. So continuing from chapter 62, Isaiah describes the arrival of the Messiah to Jerusalem at the end of the tribulation. Remember, in chapter 62, verse 11, behold, your salvation comes, and his reward is with him. What does that look like? What does that actually mean? Isaiah is going to describe that, actually in detail, how it physically appears. So here we go. Speaking now from the perspective of Jewish survivors in Jerusalem during the siege of the Antichrist, Isaiah describes a mysterious and gruesome traveler that approaches Jerusalem from the east, from Jordan, essentially. He's making his way. Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bozrah? Isaiah recognizes that the traveler comes by way of Bozrah, the capital city of Edom, to the southeast. This is likely because the traveler is accompanied. How do they recognize that he's coming from Edom? I think it's because he's accompanied by people from Bozrah, specifically freed prisoners who were formerly imprisoned in Bozrah. And there are some other references to that we can look at in the notes, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, but you can see them there. I've got some receipts for you. But anyway, he's going to clarify this in a lot more detail here in a moment. And Isaiah is telling then the remnant of Jerusalem inquire of the identity of this traveler. And the traveler identifies himself. Who is this? He who is in splendid apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. This strong, crimson-clothed warrior. It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. It is he. I am he. Your salvation comes. The Isaiah 40 promise is now here. And the one who's been speaking it in chapter 61 and 62, here he is. So, the inquiry continues. Why is your apparel red? Like you're bleeding somewhere. And your garments, like one who treads a wine press. Have you, been in a wine press, or are you bleeding or wounded somewhere? No, in fact, it's not the Messiah's blood. It's quite a different explanation. The Messiah explains that the stains are not wine, not his own blood, but they're the blood of the slain captors of Jewish prisoners that he encountered on his way to Jerusalem. I have trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath, and their life blood has spattered onto my garments and stained all of my apparel, because this is the day of vengeance. This is where we were. I'm just scroll up to show you. 61 verse 2. The day of vengeance of our God. Remember, when Jesus read Isaiah 61 in Luke chapter 4, he stopped short of the day of vengeance. That's because this, Isaiah 63, is the bloodstained day of vengeance Messiah. This is that. And it's a year of redemption, the year of the Lord's favor. I looked, but there was no one to help. This is the Messiah speaking. I looked, and there was no one to help, and was appalled that there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation. Now, in as many words, the Messiah is directly quoting Isaiah 59. And let me just show you Isaiah 59. It's in the notes if you want to look at it. It's a little bit small for me to show you in the video. Let me see if I can pull it up and how small it truly looks. But there it is. I'm just going to read it for you briefly. Because Isaiah in chapter 59 says, Yahweh saw it, and it displeased him. He saw that there was no man and no one to intercede or to uphold. So his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. He put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, so he will repay wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies. To the coastlands, he will render repayment. This is exactly what is transpiring here. And here, the Messiah says, I am he who looked, and there was no one to help. So my arm is bringing salvation. I mean, he is definitely making a claim of divinity in this case. I mean, you cannot argue the divinity away from this statement, because this is that. He's saying, I am he. And to say I am he is to say, I am the one of whom Isaiah spoke in chapter 59, who was Yahweh. I trampled them down in my anger. I made them drunk with my wrath. I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Again, there's more cross references to this in the notes, but this concludes kind of the part of the revelation of the Messiah, ending in verse 6, of course, culminating with the one who is bloodstained, the bloodstained revelation of the Messiah. And in verse 7 kind of starts the response. Here in verse 7, 63 verse 7 into the prayer of 64, they go together. This is the response to the revelation of the Messiah in 61, 62, and 63, up to verse 6. So, as I describe in the notes, starting in verse 7, all the way into chapter 64, Isaiah begins what many commentators describe as a community lament. It's a prayer for the fulfillment of God's covenant promises, and it's the perspective of the Jewish survivors. Somehow, Isaiah is writing kind of like by proxy, almost like a pre-scripted prayer or prediction of what they would pray, or how they could pray when this revelation is transpiring and when they're in the midst of the tribulation. And I think, too, part of this is kind of a pre-scripted prayer of what to pray when, and part of it is just some hope, just to give you a sense of this train is still on the tracks. This is what the Lord predicted, and he is the deliverer of old, and he promises to deliver you the same in that day as he did in the days of old. And that's what he's going to get into here, kind of a hopeful message at this point. This section of prayer, it becomes kind of a message of hope, especially from verses 7 through 14. For Israel during the final tribulation, he says, I will recount the steadfast love of the Lord according to all that he has granted us. Again, he just goes on to describe God has been good to us historically. He's given us covenant blessing throughout the ages. For verse 8, for he said, surely they are my people, children who will not deal falsely. And I think what he's saying here in verse 8 is calling a nation, choosing a nation in whom he sees, the way that he orchestrates it, the way that he chooses them and brings them out and delivers them, to produce a nation that will not deal falsely. Now, Israel did deal falsely historically. They rebelled against the covenant, but there's potential for a nation to be birthed that will not deal falsely out of this people. And that's what happens in the Messianic age. So don't get too confused or hung up on verse 8. That's okay. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the notes. And then there's this whole reference to, in their affliction, I was afflicted. Now, what's beautiful about that is the Lord shares in Israel's affliction. He doesn't just afflict them dispassionately. He's not just observing their affliction dispassionately, but he shares in their affliction. It wounds him as it wounds them. Throughout history, this affliction also motivates God to deliver them. And so here it comes. In his love, in his pity, he redeemed them. The angel of his presence saved them. And he goes on to say, as in the days of old. He talks about he carried them all in the days of old. And there are lots of references to the angel of God's presence, or some kind of equivalent to that phrase in their deliverance from Egypt. And I've got all those references in the notes. Exodus 23, Exodus 32, Exodus 33, Numbers 20, Deuteronomy 4. A lot of references to the people of Israel being led out of Egypt and through the wilderness by the Lord's presence, or by the angel of the Lord, or as Isaiah likes to summarize here, the angel of his presence saved them. And the angel of his presence will save them again. That's the point. But here's the problem. He delivered them from Egypt in the days of old, but they rebelled. Their stubbornness persisted, and Moses predicted this. This is historical, all the way to the final rebellion at the end of the age. Moses said, "Behold," here it is, "for I know how rebellious and stubborn you are. Behold, even today, while I am alive with you, you have been rebellious against the Lord. How much more after my death?" Moses said, "You're going to be a rebellious people. So let me tell you a redemptive story." And he does that in Deuteronomy 32. And really what we're reading in all these chapters of 60 to 66 is just a elaboration on the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. If you want to, you can go back and revisit that. I covered that in previous weeks. But let's just move on here for the sake of time. Israel rebelled. They grieved his spirit historically, and in the final rebellion, therefore, he turned to be their enemy. And there's lots of reinforcement of this in previous parts of Isaiah, again, which we don't have the time to cover all of here. I put some references in the notes for you. And God himself fought against them. The Lord actually raises up their affliction during the tribulation. Again, Isaiah has well substantiated this already, so I'm not covering it in a whole lot of time here. But it's an important thing to recognize. The Lord did raise up their affliction in response to their rebellion as a disciplinary measure to prompt repentance and returning, to call them back to covenant loyalty so that they can inherit covenant blessing. That's how the whole scenario unfolds. Israel rebels, God disciplines them and calls them back to covenant faithfulness. They return, and there's covenant blessing. That's the whole kind of storyline that's been unfolding. And that's what Isaiah is summarizing here. Then he remembered the days of old, Moses and his people. Where is he? And he starts to describe God, the Lord is the one who delivers, saying, I'm the one who delivered. I'm going to summon my strength and deliver them again. Isaiah recounts the story of Israel's deliverance from Egypt as an example of hope for future deliverance. And the Lord is kind of summoning this, the Lord is summoning this memory to deliver them again. And so here comes this prayer for deliverance. Isaiah offers this prayer that's likely sort of a prescripted version of what Israel could pray during their gradual spiritual awakening toward the end of the tribulation. As they're realizing this, realizing the extent of their rebellion, and realizing that God has made deliverance available to them, here comes this response prayer of, Lord, would you look down from heaven, from your holy habitation, where your zeal and might starts to call forth deliverance. God, would you deliver us? Hosea 14 is a very similar prayer that's very recent in Israel's history to the time of Isaiah, saying, Israel, return to the Lord, for you've stumbled because of your iniquity, and when you return, take words with you. Say, take all of our iniquity away, for in you even the orphan finds mercy. This is kind of just a response saying, we're going to return to the Lord, and these are some words that we can take with us. Now, not all of these words are entirely justified, but they are the response. They are the, they may not all be an accurate representation of everything that happens, but they are a heartfelt turning that Israel begins to experience, even though they might still have some misrepresentations of what occurred, what transpired. And I'll explain that here in a moment. For you are our Father. They start to appeal to the very foundation. Beyond Israel, beyond Abraham, their forefathers, they appeal straight to the one who made the covenant in the first place, the one who called Abraham. You are our Father, the one who called Abraham. You're our Redeemer. From old is your name. Our Redeemer from old is your name. O Lord, why do you make us wander from your ways and harden our heart that we might fear you not? Now at this point, verse 17, Isaiah is acknowledging the question. They're questioning whether or not this is truly the optimal scenario to accomplish God's redemptive purposes. They're challenging, is this really the best way that this would have happened to us in the tribulation? That our leaders would have embraced such a depth of rebellion so stubbornly, that their hearts would have been so hardened. Is this really the best way? Kind of just wanted to challenge that a little bit. Is this truly the least severe means to accomplish the most redemptive outcome? Could we not have maybe lessened the severity of this a little bit? Again, valid question, although the Lord's going to answer it and reinforce, justify exactly why he did things the way that he did. So they pray, return for the sake of your servants, your holy people, held possession of your land for a little while, but our adversaries have trampled down your sanctuary. We have become like those whom you never ruled. Again, the destruction of the tribulation is very, extensive. But interestingly, though Israel, this is so interesting to current events, because here the people of Israel are saying, we held possession of the temple for a little while, but then it was betrayed. That's why this is so fascinating to pay attention to in light of current events, because this could very well, become the prayer of those who right now are seeking to resume sacrifices. I find that very, very interesting. We can talk about that more in the discussion group, but there you go. That's going to conclude. Did I get to the end? Yeah, the conclusion of chapter 63.